All right. Good evening. My name is Rona DiCamillo, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for this evening. I serve as the Vice President of the League of Women Voters for Jacksonville First Coast. Our league covers Duval, Nassau, Clay, as well as here in St. Johns County. I am a St. Johns County resident. I live up in Ponte Vedra Beach, so the topics that we're talking about tonight are relevant to my everyday just as they are to your everyday. Just a little about the League of Women Voters. We are nonpartisan but political. What does that mean? It means that we don't endorse parties, we don't endorse candidates, but we do take positions on issues. So I'd like to start by thanking Flagler College for helping us put together this event. To our panelists that I will introduce in a minute, I think it's important for the community to come together, to have the opportunity to hear from experts, and to talk about issues that, as I said, matter to us here in St. Johns County. Our plan for the evening is quickly to do some introductions, although I feel like most of our panel members probably don't need an introduction. Each panelist has prepared a short presentation that'll be about 10 minutes. We may have some panel questions in between, and then we are going to leave time at the end for audience questions. And you should have received a 3x5 note card when you came in. At one point, I'm gonna have you just raise your hand, and we have a couple of Flagler College students who will come around, collect the cards, and then I will try to organize them into some sort of order to ask our panelists. My role really is that of timekeeper, so I've already apologized to all of the panelists if I cut them off, but we're gonna try to keep on a little bit of a schedule and try to get out of here as close to 8 o'clock as we can. So our panel this evening really covers all of the environmental issues that face us here in St. Johns County. This evening, we're gonna start with Tim Deegan, who I'm sure really needs no introduction, has been on the TV news for 42 years until he recently retired. Todd Osborne is an associate professor of, and I'm going to get this wrong because I feel like there's a lot of words in it, biogeochemistry in the Whitney Lab for Marine Bioscience at the University of Florida. We have Jen Lombeck with the Matanzas Riverkeepers, and then we have Katie Bowman with the, and I've got my glasses on, I can't see, the Surf Rider Foundation. So, all right, so we are going to kick it off tonight with Tim. Tim, take it away.
Thank you very much. Was that, you were grateful that I retired? First of all, thanks for having me. League of Women Voters. I would say, I think the title is, how do we impact the world's environment, or the environment of the world? Okay, I'll read it. Environmental Town Hall, the impact we make on our world. So full disclosure for me, for our family, I would say is the vehicle we choose to buy and how we vote. And I say that to say thank you for what you all do. I am certainly not going to give advice on how you all should vote, but I will talk to you about my VW ID4 at some point if you want to. As the panel knows, I'm gonna try to focus on certainly this, but then hyper-focus on words matter. And I don't mean to use words and facts that are words to bash people in. I am coming from the perspective of the weather, obviously. More specifically, the accumulation of the weather day by day, week by week, month by month, decade by decade, millennia. So really the climate weather. But really all aspects of the environment. Plastics, water quality, sea rise. Some might say, well, those are different topics than what I'm going to talk about. Well, maybe not. I suspect the petrochemical industry has something to say about the plastics that are in the water. And certainly that has something to do with greenhouse gases, and as do the rising seas. So I think it's all connected, but I'm going to try to stay super hyper-focused on words that matter when we're all discussing with our friends, with neighbors. I guess what I'm also trying to say is Dr. Hansen, 1988, for those of you who haven't heard from him or didn't know who he was back then, in the 70s, he was actually a whiz with NASA. By most people in NASA, they were assuming this kid, Dr. Hansen, in the 70s with NASA is going to run it someday. Brilliant guy, big under the umbrella thinker, the whole bit. But the more he studied other planets, the more he started thinking, this whole CO2, methane, greenhouse thing, I care about my planet too. And so he left what was probably going to be his, well, rocket to run a NASA to think tanks. And so one thing led to another, and one paper led to another, and so 1988 came, and this is where I'm getting to words matter. He said in a Senate hearing in DC, I have 95% confidence that due to the peer review papers that are now out there, the world is primarily warming because of humans, and it will accelerate. And from that point on, most of us then heard global warming. About 1996, the parts per million of CO2, which has sort of always been our way to measure what's happening with greenhouse gases, even though that's just a measure of carbon, had gotten high enough to where the White House, Al Gore and President Clinton, invited some meteorologists to the White House. And I was there with some other meteorologists. I think eventually Jay Leno got a picture of it and did a bunch of jokes about how many meteorologists does it take to, and I won't go past that. But it also was about 1996 that I remember when I came back to Northeast Florida, Southeastern Georgia, and I was doing weather talks, and it was primarily to adults that I would hear this question. And it was normally a talk about hurricane safety, hurricane preparedness. The question became, Tim, do you believe in global warming? I mean, almost like a religion. Almost like it was an anti-religion, if I can put it that way. And so that's when it really started hitting me that this was going past what science and peer review papers were finding and how people were using words to define this as a problem we want to get a solution to, or that four-letter word, is it a hoax? So by 2002, I don't know why I remember that year other than the fact that my dad, who was pretty open-minded about reading editorials from all sides of the equation, a little more conservative than me, but he really was trying to figure this warming thing out. He said, Tim, really, what does 1 degree matter? Well, that was significant to me in two areas. First of all, as many here probably know, science talks in centigrade, and most of the world talks in centigrade. But here we talk in Fahrenheit. And so as he's watching the news, and by 2002, the world, most science says the world had probably warmed by humans by a degree. They meant Celsius. Many people in the United States hear that, and it's Fahrenheit. Actually, 1 degree Celsius is almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's that problem. But I got it then, and I still get it now. What's the big deal about 1 degree, 2 degree? And in my opinion, that's back to words matter. That's how the whole global warming title for me wasn't working. Or at least it couldn't work as well as maybe some other titles. Thank goodness, Dr. Hansen, again, 2008, writes a book. By this point, he has grandchildren. By this point, remember, he started this in 1988 as far as going public. Here it is, 2007, when he's writing the book. He thought by this point, the arguments would simply be, what's the best way to come up with a solution, instead of, do you believe in or not? And by this point, he had grandchildren. He's Norwegian, and I guess at one point one of his, I guess was listening to his grandfather, and one of his grandchildren said, well, Papa, if you know this, why aren't parents doing anything about this? And that's basically when he decided to go public, and he wrote a book called Storms of Our Grandchildren. And I think he made a great point, and this book written in 2008 still, in my opinion, stands up in 2026. And that is that, yes, he talked about warming, but he also reminded us what this guy, I don't know if you can see, it's Einstein, said a few decades earlier about E equals MC squared. And the point that Hansen was making was warmth is heat. And the more heat we pump into the atmosphere, the more energy we put into the atmosphere. And the more energy that's in the atmosphere, that chaos will eventually organize into storms. And so then he took it to the whole storm bit. And what he said in 2008, for any, I don't know if there's any actuarials out there in the insurance industry, I suspect what he said then, insurance companies are now seeing on their balance sheets now. In our world, you gonna throw something at me when we get close to 7 minutes? Because I don't, okay, we're good, okay. In our world, I understand why we talk about hurricanes and stormier weather, as well as we should. But the atmosphere really doesn't care about the season. I mean, what we just had was a good example. I mean, even the winter storms are stronger than the winter storms used to be. There's just plain more energy. So, but unfortunately, by the time he wrote that book, Storms of Our Grandchildren, and I thought the focus would start going toward more storms, or hey, I was hoping people would start connecting the dots of more heat equals stormier weather. By that point, I think, and if you think back, the terminology, instead of global warming, we started hearing more the terminology climate change. We still hear that a lot. I understand why that is used. I personally think at least 50% of the US population uses that to say the climates have always changed. It's not us humans. So we're going to vote this way. So for me, although I understand why people use climate change, for me, if I'm going to say words matter, not a good title. So I'm going to go to greenhouse gas crisis. For me, those words work. Dr. Hansen, when he first went to the Senate, he used the word greenhouse gas crisis. But global warming is what caught on. So let's talk about those words. First of all, I think the terminology greenhouse does a great job of kind of describing what the what we call them, greenhouse gases do. Best I can tell, and I know there's a lot of educated people here, so maybe you can nail down the date for me, but best I can tell, almost 2,000 years ago, they were using the term that was equivalent to greenhouse. The whole idea of we can build something to where the sun shines in, even on a cold day, the radiation will heat things on the inside, and it can keep our plants green. Now, the greenhouse gas effect, again, working off that word greenhouse, it's even in the 80s, it wasn't some new radical scientific thing. I think it's taught in 4th and 5th grade science now, but we can all the way go back to Guy Callender. In fact, it's actually called the Callender effect. He worked for the military, British military, and in 1938, he had done enough papers to where the rest of science around the world called the effect that works specifically with greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, a couple others as well, but those are the two big ones, that he proved in his paper that, in fact, what humans are burning and putting into the atmosphere is causing the Earth to warm, and it was called, all the way back to 1938, the Guy Callender effect. So it's not something new. In fact, ladies, and to me this is where not only do words matter, but who's sharing the words. Of course, as you can imagine, Guy Callender really did his papers on the shoulders of so many generations of scientists. How far back? Check this out. 1856, a paper was presented in the United States Of course, we were just considered primitive, uneducated people back then, but still, in a science symposium in the Northeast, a paper was presented on the greenhouse effect, but specifically CO2. And a young man presented the paper. However, a young woman, her name Eunice Foote, F-O-O-T-E, actually wrote it. But of course, that can get us to a whole nother topic. So that's the greenhouse part. Okay, that science is well founded and documented. There's just, it is what it is. So what about the crisis part? If we look at temperature and we look at peer-reviewed papers, that's all we're talking about here. And if we're super conservative, that is 100% of all papers at least say we're warming 100 times faster than any other time in Earth's history. I think some of our other folks here that are connected with animal life will say that's a whole lot faster than most life can handle. And most papers really say we're warming 1,000 to 10,000 times faster. That, to me, is enough to say crisis. But let's talk about the ocean. You know, it used to be that, when I say used to, 80s, 90s, that there was this idea that as the oceans warmed and expanded, but then more significantly as the ice melted, we'd see this with ocean level rise. So, you know, the Industrial Revolution really kicked into the late 1800s, right? But by the mid-1900s, everybody's burning something around the world, to put it primitively. So we start seeing the oceans rise. Maybe an eighth of an inch a year in the 60s and 70s. Now we're up to a quarter, and that's beginning to accelerate. But it adds up. And even that trend starts becoming a problem. I don't think in St. Augustine we have to say too much about the fact that that as bad as Matthew was, you know, the eye wall of Matthew stayed offshore. And look what Matthew did to us. In other words, the fact that the oceans are now easily 1, maybe in some places 2 feet above what they used to be, that's equivalent to a nor'easter here. And then we're adding on top of that. But what I want to get to is the tipping bucket. And that is that in the 80s and the 90s, it was the radical scientists that said, oh, you know, but there were times in Earth's history when the water levels rose in a straight line and then suddenly, like a tipping bucket, they went off the charts. That's now becoming, at least I would say, what the majority of science thinks is going to happen. I'm not talking like the movies, but that we can't really look at it as a trending line. If more, it's going to be more of an accelerating. Some would say that makes this a crisis. But as I think, money tends to talk, money tends to yell, and much of the rest of the world seems to be getting it. If you look at the very least, competitively, what they're doing. For some reason, we're not. But I'll get back to insurance. And certainly in the state of Florida, a lot of insurance has been the discussion. What becomes frustrating for me is that it tends to be focusing on whether it's the lawyer's fault or the insurance company's fault. Instead of, there's more damage, folks. I just read today, an insurance company in Nocatee has just spun off a company that's going to move their headquarters to Jacksonville because they've become so successful because there's so much to do worldwide on storm damage. I'll leave it there.
Well, I'm going to ask you one question.
Okay.
So you alluded to the fact that we often tell jokes about weathermen. You know,
You laugh in our face is what you actually
okay.
do.
I didn't want to be that specific. So, you know, we would joke that you can't tell me that it's not going to rain on Saturday. How can you tell me what the weather is going to be 5 decades from now?
No, believe me, I totally get that. Because we're talking global and because we're talking averages, I do think that leads to both, I know it leads to the confidence of science, and we hope that at least for many people, it leads to their confidence. I would take it to baseball. I'm going to give my age away. Rod Carew was like when I was a kid. one of the best hitters of his time. Certainly, you wouldn't expect him, because he was the best hitter of his time, to hit or get on base every time. But you knew from his average over a season and over 10 years, he was going to get on base probably more than anyone else. So I do think the averages help us. The global nature of it helps us. And then I'll add a third bit here, and hopefully I'm not getting too deep in the water, so to speak. But the fact is, about 2/3 of our Earth is the ocean. And certainly anybody here knows that, for instance, the cold weather event we just had. We saw what happened to the air temperature. The ocean is certainly colder, but despite that dramatic drop in air temperature, where'd the ocean temperature drop? About 5 degrees. And that's because the ocean, in many ways, even if you don't have a thermometer of what's going on day in and day out, the ocean, because it absorbs and can handle those fluctuations, is a great indicator of what's happening with averages. You combine that with the fact that because the oceans cover 2/3 of the Earth, that's really where the majority of our storms will come from. So yeah, I'll leave it with that, if that helps at all.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Can you guys hear me on this? Okay. That one. This one will work. All right, here we go. Much better, much better. I'm just going to stand over in the corner. They said, Todd, don't go walking all around because you're going to take too much time, which is usually what I do. But anyway, I just want to say thank you, Rona, and thank you, Bill Hamilton, who's sitting out here for helping put this together. Appreciate you. And you get to sit up here with all these really cool people that know a lot of stuff that I want to know. All right, so what I want to talk to you guys about today is sea level rise. And this is a topic that hit a peak, I think, in its discussion several years ago, it seems like. It's gone a little quiet. But I do want to say one thing before I get into this, that the city of St. Augustine is very progressive in planning for sea level rise. But I'm going to indict the county a little bit in that they're kind of lagging behind. And so we want to get there with this discussion and with our call to action a little bit. Tim just mentioned this curve, and I don't want you to worry about all that text on there, but I want you to see the idea here. We've got measured changes, and those measured changes are not just a straight line. That's a curve, and that curve is a little scary because we don't know how that's going to work. Even these are current projections by models that tell us it could be anywhere from 3.5 feet to 6.5 feet. That's a lot of water on our coastline, and any of you guys know that live on the beach, you probably see this a little bit more often. But that's a disturbing graph for a lot of reasons. And I want to get into that a little bit. Even more disturbing maybe is that this comes from real data. These projections come from real data, but sea level rise doesn't occur evenly across the globe. Sea level rise in Savannah, Georgia may be very different than it is in St. Augustine. And I'll tell you, from what we understand, we have one of the longest running tide gauge and sea level surface gauges in the country, in Mayport. And we also, from that data, can tell that our sea level rise impact is the highest rate in the state of Florida, and comparable to some of the other very high rates on the East Coast of the United States. So we're kind of at that epicenter. And we are one for other reasons too. Some of you have seen me talk about climate change and mangroves, but this is a little bit of a scary thing. And this runs up to 2020. Surprisingly, I couldn't find data for the current. But I got to be careful. Okay, so the other thing I want to tell you is that, as Tim mentioned, science tells us that we've been here before. If you look at 2.3 million years ago, our sea level was 100 feet higher than it is now. Just 20,000 years ago in the Ice Age, and you guys that have been to the springs and found mastodon teeth and things like that can attest to this, that we did have that Ice Age, and we were 400 feet lower than we are now. Now, those time scales are huge, right? But 10,000 years ago, we were pretty stable, post-Ice Age. And all of a sudden, we've started moving up. The speed and rapidity of how that happens are unknown. But right now, we're feeling the impacts of it, right? And that's a thing to think about. If you question that, talk to any of my surfing buddies that are in here, because I see you everywhere. They're at the beach every day. They see the changes that we see on our beachscape, and they know that our barrier island is shifting. That's part of the process. They also know that sea level rise isn't noticed, over long periods of time. Well, it came up a half an inch. What's the big deal? It came up in the last 50 years, 7 inches. The next 30 is projected to be 9 inches. Does that foot and a half really make a difference? Well, it does when it comes to storm surges. We've been through it, right? We've seen it. If you're driving across the 206 bridge, just look toward the mainland, and you see this. This is coastal forest retreat happening all around our state in various degrees, depending on how steep our terrestrial boundary is. It's either more or less obvious. On the Gulf Coast around Cedar Key, this little fringe of dying trees from too much salinity is about 1.5 miles long. It's expansive. We don't see it a lot because you can't get there without an airboat. It's a low population center, right? But this is happening. If you have Google Earth at home, and I hope you do, just check it out sometime. You can see this from space. You can see coastal forest retreat from space. In Florida and in our own areas, it's more pronounced than others. You can also see this driving across the bridge from west to east on 312. Just look at Fish Island. Yeah, you see all those beautiful old pine trees and oak trees are dying back. That's not from a single storm surge. That's from repeated salinization of soils, right? And that's a thing that's happening. So the evidence is there. The question is, how much does that impact us? And as a wetlands guy, as a soils guy, that's where I got my training. The one thing that comes to mind to me is that we have this wonderful, beautiful state with all of these really cool ecosystems in it. A lot of us live here because of these. But you think about pine flatwoods, maritime hammocks, even xeric escapes over there, and as we get over to Palatka, sinkhole lakes, cypress domes. Everybody's familiar with those, and even open marshes. But the interplay between those ecosystems, between wetlands and uplands, are simply just small variations in elevation. It only takes a few inches in Florida to make an upland a marsh. What's really weird is that a change in sea level also elevates our terrestrial groundwater. Nobody thinks about that. If you're on a septic system, you got to be thinking about it, because at some point it won't work anymore. It'll be drowned out. And you might be living in your neighborhood, and this is actually happening on US 1. Anybody knows where Davis Drive is on US 1, across from Davis Drive? There's a whole neighborhood that's having to be pump drained because groundwater just keeps creeping up, and it's gotten to a point where the neighborhood's turning into a marsh. And so this is a big problem. And it's subtle. It's not one that you would think about. But the message I want to give you is sea level rise is not just a coastal phenomenon. This picture was taken right outside the door here, October 10th, last year, just a few months ago, during king tides. This is a natural tidal cycle of the ocean. And what I meant by that, sea level rise isn't just like slowly rising. You'll see this in increments. It's sporadic in the fact that you'll see it expressed in high tides, in storm surges. And these are issues that impact us more. I got a question. I have two questions, because you can't put a scientist on the stage with a microphone and a bunch of people and not want me to collect data. So I'm going to ask two things. First thing, who's been impacted by sea level rise already that can say it's happened, I've felt it? Okay. Wow, that's a lot of people. That's more than I expected that would raise their hands. I promise you in the next 10 years, almost all of us will be able to say indirectly or directly, we've had some impact. Whether you live in town, you have your business in town, or whatever, these things are happening, right? The other question I have, and I meant to start with this, was how did you find out about tonight? I'm going to ask this question. So did you see this on TV or hear it on the radio? Raise your hand. Okay, one or two. All right. How about social media? Did you see it in social media? Oh, there go the hands. Okay. And then, and I'll count email too as social media. So, and then old school social media. So one of your friends talked to you about it, like you actually spoke to a human. Okay, I like that. Okay, so there's two. The last two are real important. Let's keep that in mind. Okay, JFK said a rising tide lifts all boats. And my point tonight was to say that we got to have a boat if we're going to go with that rise, right? So the question is, how do we build a boat? And this is something I hope we talk about a little bit tonight, but I put out my thoughts on that. And again, I want to say the city of St. Augustine has been thinking this way for a while. City management is great. I love it. They're working on these problems. But we've got to identify a couple of things and accept the fact that we humans, at some point, have to retreat, right? I mean, we can't just armor the entire coastline and try to build it up. And with that, we need ecosystems to retreat to. I don't have a pointer, but if you look at that corner of that picture, that's Moses Creek. Favorite place of mine to go fishing. And you'll notice that marsh has got to expand. I said, well, okay, we let that happen, but why? Everybody in here probably knows that wetlands are very valuable ecosystems. I don't have to tell you that ecosystem services are tremendous, something else we might talk about tonight, but they're valued at $120,000 per acre annually in the services they provide our community. So that's something we have to also think about. We cannot forego those aquatic ecosystems expanding with sea level rise, and that's exactly what they're doing when you see coastal forest retreat. It's happening, right? I really think we need to think about resiliency. And my other big point about this is land use planning. Seems like development is everywhere. And it's a problem because we have to have a place to retreat to, not just us. But these ecosystems, these critical ecosystems have to have a place to go to. So I call on the county to stand firm in their plan. You know, we've got to stop just rubber stamping development everywhere. Or we have no place to go, okay? Some other things that we're going to talk about, we're going to hear some of these from other speakers tonight, but enhancing conservation land acquisition and connectivity. Some people in this audience, and I'm looking at you over here, are heroes about this because they have been active in this. But we also need to preserve and increase our open space wherever possible. And I say that not just for us, but for the ecosystems that support us. This is a huge thing. And it's like, well, it's 25 years from now, it's 30 years from now. Try to remove a neighborhood after the fact, right? That's just not going to happen. And I really want to put a plug in here. We're going to hear more about this in a few minutes too, but improving our transitional upland habitats and our aquatic habitats with nature-based solutions. These things that are working. I'm involved in that in my work at the university, and I really think it's helpful. But what I want to point out here is just that we're unique in the state of Florida. You know, you guys moved here for a reason, and I know that the historic nature of St. Augustine is part of that, but it's not all of it. I think most of you are here tonight because you enjoy the environment and you enjoy the outdoors and you care about it. We have places. This is Matanzas Inlet down here in the corner. Pellicer Creek missed the slide, unfortunately, but that's a very important estuary. Moses Creek is up there on 206. But we have space for natural ecosystems to expand, right? But not if they're all filled in, not if they're all sold, okay, for development. So that's something we have to think about. And if you need a little encouragement, look at Miami. Where are you going to go? Well, I'll give you a little personal data because this is only observation from Todd in the shores. But 3 of my last 5 new neighbors came from Miami. They're literally refugees from South Florida because just during blue sky flooding, during high tides in the fall, which is our natural highest tide cycles of the year, October, November, their houses are flooding. Can't sell a flooded house, especially when you've been on the news down there. So there's an exodus going on in Miami for a reason because they have no place to go. And they lost their coastal ecosystems a long time ago with seawalls and such. So there's nowhere for that to go either. So that's my closing. We'll talk about some of these things in our call to action and with questions.
Jen?
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if you were going to questions. All right. Is this one working now? Excellent. All right. So Todd actually set me up with a really great segue there. I'm going to stay sitting so I can look at my clock so that I don't just speak for 45 minutes because I want to do that. Hey, y'all. I'm Jen Lumberg. I have had the honor of serving as your Matanzas Riverkeeper for the past 8 years now. And so... Y'all are gonna make me blush. So I'm gonna provide a high-level picture of land use in the state, water use in the state, and then water quality to kind of set the stage for zooming this conversation in a little bit here. So like Todd mentioned, it is no surprise that folks are moving to Florida. About 1,000 people a day move to the state of Florida. And when you do that math, that equates to something like a city the size of Orlando being added to the state every single year. And so we're now faced with this challenge of figuring out how to balance land use with what land's going to be used for development, what land's going to be used for agriculture, and what land is going to be conserved to protect some of those ecosystem services that Todd was talking about. And so the graphics that I have up on the screen here are from a really interesting presentation that was done by the folks over at 1000 Friends of Florida and the University of Florida Geoplan Center. This project was called Florida 2070. And so basically what they did was they created a baseline in the year 2010 for what the state looked like. And then using projected growth rates and census data, they extrapolated what the state was going to look like in the year 2070. And so the map over here on the left, the 2010 baseline, you've got the red areas that are your developed areas. You've got the dark green areas that are conserved areas, whether that is for natural resource value or for agriculture. And then you've got the kind of lightish green, yellow areas that are what's left, what is either going to be conserved or developed at some point in the future. And then same thing for the 2070 map. And so the population for the state of Florida is projected to increase to over 33 million residents by the year 2070. And if we continue to develop in the way that we have been developing, we are on trend to have about a third of the state developed by the year 2070. And so if we stay on that trend, we're really going to start to lose those natural areas. We're going to start to lose those ecosystem services that those areas provide unless we have a real reckoning with how and where we develop land in the state of Florida, but also how we prioritize land conservation. Florida used to have a really robust land conservation program. There's a state program called Florida Forever, and unfortunately, for the last decade or so, it has been critically underfunded. By the state's own internal analysis, if they wanted to buy all of the land they have earmarked as a high priority for conservation, based on current funding rates, it would take 200 years. There's not going to be a whole lot of Florida that's not paved in 200 years. And so that really underscores the sense of urgency for us to prioritize land conservation funding to start to balance that scale back in the other direction. And actually, Todd, I'm gonna hop back to one of your slides here real quick. So Todd mentioned Moses Creek Conservation Area on this slide here. If you look at the area to the north of Moses Creek, what sits between that development and the waterway, that's about 200 acres of land that St. Johns County had designated as its #1 highest priority for conservation. But the county didn't have enough money to buy it. And so now a developer has come in and has put in a pre-development application, so the county's lost its chance to preserve that property. And so we really, really need to double down and focus on funding land conservation so that these ecosystems have an area to retreat to, so that we still have some of those buffers to protect our waterways. And so moving forward here, the 2010-2070 comparison here is for water. And so basically what this shows is it shows water consumption in gallons per day per acre. So you can see the darker red areas, the more heavily developed areas are areas where there are a lot of people who consume a lot of water. And so if you look at the 2010 baseline compared to the 2070, we are projected to double our water consumption by the year 2070. And development-related water use is projected to be the biggest driver of water consumption. When you look at how the state currently uses water, right now about half of the potable water in the state of Florida is used for landscape irrigation. And to be clear, that's not agriculture, that's not irrigation for crops to grow food, that is lawns and golf courses and manicured areas. And so when you think about the value to society, like yes, a pretty lawn is a very nice thing, but drinking water is literally critical to our survival. And so we're already experiencing severe water shortages throughout the state. If anybody has been out kayaking or doing anything anywhere near the water recently, I'm sure you've noticed water levels are really low right now. We haven't had a lot of rain recently. And so there are limitations on water use already in many parts of the state. And so looking at these projections, it really underscores how we need to reevaluate our relationship with what we are allocating our water use for. And you can't talk about water quantity without talking about water quality. And so this map here is it's a screenshot from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's map for water quality. And so the gray areas of the map here are what they call waters not attaining standards. So these are waterways that are currently failing to meet their state designated water quality standards. And you can see that it's a pretty grim picture, right? There is not a whole lot of the state that is not currently failing to meet their state designated water quality standards. And so we are already starting to pollute our waterways at a pretty intense scale. And something that we like to remind folks of is that it is so much easier to prevent pollution and to keep a waterway clean than it is to fix it or restore it or clean it up after it's become polluted. I'm sure folks have heard the tales of the millions of dollars that have been pumped into the Indian River Lagoon trying to fix those mistakes, the millions of dollars that they spent trying to restore the Kissimmee River after they straightened it out. So getting out ahead of these issues is not only the more environmentally friendly choice, it's the more economically viable choice. And so when you look at all of these different pollution issues, there are really two that are the most common pollution issues that we're dealing with in Florida, and those are nutrient pollutions and fecal bacteria. And fecal bacteria, I feel like, is fairly self-explanatory. Like, you hear fecal bacteria and you think, well, that shouldn't be in the water, and that is correct. But we do have, unfortunately, a lot of fecal bacteria entering our waterways from failing wastewater infrastructure. So that could be septic tanks that are old or are getting flooded and are subject to sea level rise, or that could be wastewater treatment facilities that are either having sewage spills or have infrastructure that is being flooded or breaking down, and you get leaks underground and then nobody knows that it's leaking. And the state's own internal analysis of the need for wastewater infrastructure is $20 billion for upgrades and maintenance for what currently exists in the state. And unfortunately, the state has been prioritizing infrastructure for new developments rather than funding the infrastructure that needs to be fixed and upgraded. And so we keep contributing to this pollution issue because unfortunately more people often means more pollution, especially if we keep doing things the way that we have been doing them in the past. Nutrient issues, that one can be a little bit more confusing to folks because I think a lot of folks hear nutrients and they think, well, like, nutrients are good, right? Like, you eat a salad because it's got vitamins and nutrients. And that concept is true for ecosystems to a certain extent. And when we're talking about nutrients, we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus, namely. And so there should be a naturally occurring level of nitrogen and phosphorus in most ecosystems. The issue is when you have too much nitrogen or too much phosphorus. A waterway can enter a state of being called eutrophic. And that's when you start to get the harmful algal blooms. That's when you can have decreasing oxygen levels. That's when you start to have fish kills. And I'm sure folks have seen the Summer of Slime back in 2018 when there was the harmful algal blooms and the water looked like guacamole. And unfortunately, we keep seeing these harmful algal blooms cropping up every summer, but something that's making me really nervous right now is that we've already started to see harmful algal blooms start popping up now. And it is way too cold for us to start having harmful algal blooms. We've started seeing some down in the Calusa Basin, up in Tallahassee there are some. And so that signals that those waterways are incredibly eutrophic. They have way too many nutrients in them. And so when you think about the source of these nutrients, it can come from wastewater like septic tanks or wastewater treatment facilities, but it also often comes from stormwater runoff. A lot of the fertilizer that is land applied in our state, either residentially or to agriculture, not all of it is taken up by those plants. So when it rains, that fertilizer can be washed down a storm drain, discharged into a nearby waterway. In the same way that it helps plants on a landscape grow, it helps algae to grow in the water column. And so really dealing with how we treat our landscape is something that we need to be cognizant of in order to prevent some of this pollution from getting into our waterways. And then I also just wanted to flag emerging contaminants really quickly. So as technology continues to evolve and as we start to create new chemicals to do things for us, we really need to be cognizant of the long-term unintended consequences of those contaminants, because we're starting to see things like heavy metals and pharmaceuticals and PFAS ending up in a lot of our ecosystems. And for folks who aren't familiar with PFAS, PFAS is an acronym for per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. Really glad I nailed that. And basically what that means is it's a chemical with a really strong carbon-fluorine bond. And that makes the chemical very tough, and so it's used in things like water-resistant clothing, fire-retardant fabrics, firefighting foam, nonstick pans. And the benefit that it brings to products is the issue that it has when it's discharged into our waterways, because it does not break down. It's incredibly persistent, and that's how it got the nickname Forever Chemicals. And we're starting to find these in shellfish, in people's blood samples, in waterways. And the PFAS are associated with certain types of cancers and endocrine disruptions. And so figuring out how to stop the flow of those things entering our waterways is something that's going to be critically important. And so this paints a pretty bleak picture, and I apologize for that. There's a lot that we're trying to kind of work on at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. And I think that things are rough at the federal level right now. Things are a little rough at the state level right now. Also, I was in Tallahassee yesterday. But I think we have a huge opportunity at the local level, because we have really engaged communities. We have the opportunity, we can take our elected officials out on a boat and show them an ecosystem and show them the waterways that are impacted by these pollution issues. And so that's really where I think we have a lot of opportunity to start to address these issues. That being said, there's been a disturbing trend in the last decade or so where the state has started to step in and preempt local governments from adopting certain types of regulations. And basically that means that the state decides that they are going to regulate an issue and a local government is no longer allowed to do that. And that could be anything from plastic pollution to the way that wetlands are protected to how vacation rentals are regulated, anything like that. But by them taking that power away from local governments, it makes those issues that much more challenging to actually deal with. And so that's something that we have been pushing back against, because we really do feel like one of the best ways to solve local issues is at the local level. So I'll go ahead and stop talking there because I'm pretty sure I went over time and I'm sorry.
No, that's great. And I want to circle back to Todd for a second. And Todd, I didn't ask this question at the end of your presentation because I wanted everyone to see the slides for 2070 and have this in mind, because one of the questions that we had talked about was what happens if our coastal wetlands cannot expand landward when sea levels rise? Well, what do we do when our population is going to get to what it looks like in 2070? I mean, we've got, it feels to me like very competing issues, and do you have solutions?
Well, okay, I'll start with the correct politically answer would be like, well, we've just got to do our best. But the reality of it is, I mean, honestly, if we're up to me, it would be arguing to refund and fund the acquisition of land, natural lands, as fast as we could. I mean, absolutely 100%. Nobody wants us to put well, I don't know, maybe some of us do, put a gate on 95 where it meets Georgia, or 75. But the truth is, if there's no place to build, perhaps some of this will slow down. I know that may be a little extreme view, but at the same time, I look at it and say, well, if we develop every square inch of our coast, those systems have nowhere to go. So we lose our fisheries, we lose our tourism, especially our ecotourism, and that means our economy crashes. I mean, if anybody's aware of the monetary benefits that our coastlines bring to Florida, just the Space Coast, just for instance, let's take this because I read this recently, from New Smyrna to Stuart, Florida, $28 billion a year. That should resonate. I mean, that's, a lot of our jobs in our communities exist because of that. We can't afford to lose our coastlines. And something that never gets, rarely gets mentioned is just the power of attraction for people to come visit. But we also necessarily want them to move here and stay. And that's the thing. I mean, we have to consider, we have a limited amount of space, how are we going to use it? And if we're looking forward 50 years, that planning should be happening now.
And Jen, just one follow-up question for you, because I'm a little alarmed about the quality of my water. Where do we go for reliable information about the quality of our water?
That's a great question. So if anybody is particularly interested in a specific waterway that might be near their home or just kind of getting a big picture view of what the water quality like is in their city, EPA has a tool called How's My Waterway. You can Google EPA How's My Waterway, and then you can enter in a specific address, a specific creek name, or an entire city, and it'll kind of give you a breakdown of which waterways are meeting water quality standards. If they aren't, then what pollutants are contaminating them, and that's just a really helpful resource for you to get an idea of what your local waterways are actually impacted by.
Great, thank you. Just a note, if you have a question that you've written down on your card, if you want to kind of hold that up, we have a couple of Flagler College students who will come around and collect those, because Katie is our last presenter. And Katie, you're going to leave us with a smile on her face, right?
I'm going to try. You may not believe me in some parts, but we are going to try to end with a smile. So I'm Katie Bauman. I am the Florida Policy Manager for the Surfrider Foundation, and have the honor of going after all of these speakers who have really primed everything and kind of given you everything to think about. And what now I want to focus on is getting into some of these aspects of what coastal resilience means here. And I'm so glad Todd just said what he said, because when we think about resilience, yes, it is environmental resilience. It is making sure these habitats and these ecosystems can sustain and continue. It is economic resilience. It is continuing to support one of the biggest drivers for our economy in this state. As he said, that $28 billion number, over 80 billion from our beaches across the state. Record numbers of tourism to our state in 2024, contributing to a tourism value of over $133 billion in the state. Most of that being attraction to our waterways, our coastal recreation, our beaches. And then of course, it's resilience of our livelihoods. It's resilience of our Florida way of life. And so resilience means so much, and that's what I want us to think about as we go through this section. And I'll talk about some aspects of how we're working on resilience, things that have been mentioned with nature-based solutions, and then more specifically, some of the policy and state law and state work that we're doing, many of the groups up here doing that. So, this is a fun reminder. This is from Todd's, but this is just to remind you of what we're up against. And so I want to bring you to just looking at, for Surfrider, we're a nonprofit dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of our ocean, waves, and beaches for all people. And we operate through an extensive grassroots network. What you see there are our 12 volunteer-led chapters across the state of Florida. Over 8,000 miles of coast in our state. That is a lot to cover. And what you will see there, our First Coast chapter stretches from Fernandina to St. Augustine. And so that is our volunteer chapter here. Mostly the events are located in the Jacksonville Beach area, but we have members all across the state in this network. And then those issue areas, I'm going to focus on coast and climate, how it relates to some of the issues, problems, and opportunities that we have. And so to start, and this is what has been set up in probably really defining ways from our previous speakers, the challenge. And so we know that our coastal communities, our coastlines are vulnerable. We talked about what sea level rise is bringing. We've talked about those impacts on water quality. We know this greenhouse gas crisis is leading to those impacts that we see every single day. We see it in extreme weather. We see it in the very whimsical but not so funny sunny day flooding, blue skies flooding. You saw that picture of St. Augustine, you all know it well. We see it in our water quality impacts, aging infrastructure that is additionally burdened by the ways that we have developed across the state, in the ways that our population has grown. One of the fastest growing states in the country, St. Johns County being one of the fastest growing counties in the state. And so we know what we're up against here in Northeast Florida and all the way across the state. And then similarly, looking at it, if we don't plan for the future, we have so much to lose. We are well aware of what we stand to lose because we are actively losing it. We are seeing that happen when we go out and enjoy places that our grandparents or others have enjoyed in the past, and it is not the same. And we know that disconnected, top-down changes don't work. They fail our communities. And I want to focus on the disconnected there because that also stands for things that I would say, oh, this is moving us in the right direction for resilience. If that is disconnected from the community where it is being implemented, it often fails. And that's the frustrating piece of this. And that's why in this next piece of how we're engaging, and this is not just how Surfrider is engaging, it is how a lot of groups are engaging and learning to engage as we do face an absolute crisis. And so the first there is community. That is what we are doing right now. That is learning from the people on the ground who are impacted by these things, being led and influence them in how we approach what these changes might be, how we might implement them, what the ideas are to put on the table. That next piece, stewardship. And I really want to include, that should include science in there as well. Stewardship and science. These are the actual actions that are going to help our coastlines and communities be more resilient, to bounce back from damage, to adapt in these different pieces. And the science is what gives us the data. That research is what characterizes then what we shift to and what I focus on, the policy. And the policy are those changes at a larger scale that we're making in our laws, in our regulations, to better reflect the circumstances and conditions that we're under right now. And so this is right down the road. You may have seen recently in the news, you've seen the houses up in North Carolina that are falling into the ocean. Well, we know we have them here. We have them here in Summerhaven. And I'm not showing this to say, I have the perfect solution, we're ready to go, no problems, let's do it. I'm showing it to again remind us, we have a lot to lose. And we don't have the luxury of waiting to solve these problems, waiting to implement plans. We have to be at the table, and we have to be addressing these problems. And so one way that was mentioned that many are focusing on, you maybe have heard this term, you heard it earlier from Todd, nature-based solutions. So what is that? That is a more ecosystem-focused, comprehensive approach to resilience, where we're using natural systems, natural things, and managing them, protecting them, and restoring them so that we get those benefits. We get those benefits in how they mitigate flooding, and how they provide buffers, natural filtration, wave attenuation. The list goes on. And it's not just environmental benefits. These are resilience benefits. These are economic benefits. These are recreational benefits. And so that's the big picture of what nature-based is when you hear that term used. Then more specifically, getting in, what does that actually mean on a project basis? Well, it means focusing on these places generally, and what that looks like in specific projects here in Northeast Florida. That's dune restoration, that's wetlands protection, that's native plants, that's invasive removals, that is protecting our public conservation land and looking to do more land acquisition. These are all projects that fall under nature-based solutions that have this range of impacts. I'll also add for South Florida, and interesting with kind of mangrove migration and what we might be seeing, but in South Florida, that also includes mangroves and coral reefs, incredible wave attenuation properties and functions for these systems. And in particular for mangroves, truly an incredible, incredible plant. And so a study out of Collier County, so on the Gulf side, South Florida, showed that mangroves provide $67 million in property protection annually in the county. During Hurricane Ian, that shot up to $4 billion from mangroves. And so we have got to be looking at these options that are more dynamic, more adaptable, and not that default of we build back harder and bigger and higher. That is not the answer, and we can see that in places where that has been the default answer. And so now to shift to some places where we've seen this in practice, and we have had the opportunity to see how community, stewardship, and science is leveraged into policy. And so for probably most everyone in this room, you don't need that header on the slide. This is Anastasia State Park from camping there a few weeks ago. And this is a gem of the region. 16,000 acres of just incredible space, public conservation land that is right here in Northeast Florida. And you might know where I'm headed with this. It was also the subject and included in the notorious, the infamous Great Outdoors Initiative. And so I want to put this slide up, and oh, it is bigger than I thought. But really, what I want you to see here, I want to point out a few things in this. So one, and I'll give an overview. I'm sure everyone here is pretty well familiar with what happened. Starting in August 2024, we had the Great Outdoors Initiative from Florida's Department of Environmental Protection leaked. And it was leaked out, and we found out that there were plans for development projects in 9 of our state parks. When I say development projects, that is resort-style lodging. That was golf courses. That was Frisbee golf courses, and it was everyone's favorite, pickleball courts. Not our favorite in our state parks. That is not what they are there for. And so we got that, and notably, Anastasia was gonna have a 350-room resort lodge on it. It was going to have the disc golf, and it was going to have pickleball courts. What we saw was people in this room. We saw Floridians, the community, not just here, but across the state, in absolute outrage and vocal opposition. And that was people from all different backgrounds and people of all different political persuasions, of all different perspectives. But what did they agree on? What did they connect to? Our public conservation land, what that offers for recreational opportunity, what that offers for environmental experiences, what that offers for resilience benefits to our very developed state. And so in seeing that, we saw organization across the state to attend these meetings that were all scheduled 1 week from the date it was released and all on the same day at the same time. We saw that work done out with local leaders and state leaders, getting to them, letting them see constituents angry about this, upset to see these things on the chopping block. And the Florida media, we do have to give it, Florida media did a great job in reporting on this and getting information out. And so what that led to was the plans being pulled, and then in a press conference unrelated to this, the information that the plans were off the table, it would not be pursued this year. Well, that gave no one in the state of Florida very much confidence that this would not be something that we had to face again. And so what was good, what did we see? We saw state legislators respond because they saw your response. They saw that unified front. And so we saw that response, but now another takeaway learning point. That bill, the bills we saw filed, okay, good starting point. They recognized that we saw a problem and we weren't happy with it, but those bills did not address all the shortcomings, all the gaps, all the loopholes that we saw put into place through that development plan. And so once again, it was Floridians, it was you across the state, nonprofit organizations, other leaders, applying consistent pressure throughout session to strengthen that bill, to not say, okay, that's good enough, to say there are still problems with it and we want permanent protections. We want this established, we've told you that. And that's a really incredible thing to see go through the Florida legislature, including, a committee where the committee chair's amendment was voted down because it did not strengthen the bill the way it needed to be strengthened. So then we saw that go through, and then again, pressure to the governor to actually sign that. It passed unanimous, bipartisan in the Florida legislature, and then applying that pressure to the governor and the governor's office. And so that was an incredible series, and that was 10 months. That was an incredible amount of work in 10 months, and also, I hate to break it to you, you all know it, problem, engagement, solution does not happen in 10 months. And so that is something to celebrate and to look at, and again, to have takeaways from. And we need to apply that to other issue areas that we are working in, and I say that to my own work, and other things that might be harder to relate to than our state parks, but our septic tanks, aging wastewater infrastructure, and other things along those lines. We have to keep that momentum going. And so that is something that I know many organizations like Surfrider and others are thinking about, of how we connect to people and connect to what they care about, what they can experience, and how we can leverage that in the state capitol. And so the last thing I'll say is, you think it's all fine and dandy. May, yay, we did it. We saved our public conservation lands. Oh, but wait, the guana land swap. And I bring this up, gasp in the crowd. But I bring this up because this is ongoing. And so this is another continuation where we saw guana land swap once again, right around the time that we were all advocating for the governor to sign this bill permanently protecting our state parks, actually stronger protections than for our national conservation land right now. And so at the same time, all of a sudden, Audubon, Florida realizes and puts out an alert that an item has been added to a state council meeting that reviews conservation land transactions. And that item would propose trading 600 acres of the Guana Wildlife Management Area right here in our backyard for scattered parcels across the state. Guana is critical coastal lands that need to be protected, that are enjoyed by many of us and many visitors to this area. The plan had sparse information, even less notice. It was up to be considered less than a week. Again, you mobilized, and you were backed by people across Florida because they saw that's happening there. Oh, well, next it's happening where I am. And we saw the applicant withdraw that. Once again, an applicant withdrawing something is not a permanent protection against this happening again. We have to keep working at our state level because that is how we scale and replicate these solutions. And so what we've seen, Representative Kim Kendall, representative from right here, has filed a bill, conservation lands, and there's a Senate companion from Senator Debbie Mayfield, and that is moving through the Florida legislature with bipartisan support once again, quickly through committees, actually cleared, I think it's last committee this week, and will be ready for a House vote, the Senate as well. This addresses those gaps in that state law that are going to ensure that we have that public notification 30 days before these things are being considered, that key information is included when we are looking at it, and that we have that ability, that accessibility to engage on these matters because they matter to us. And so that's what I want to leave you with. We have a daunting task in front of us, but we do have, we have plans for how it can work. We have a plan to make it work, and we have to keep applying that pressure constantly in order to do so. And so that is what I will leave you with, and open it up now to questions about all of these things and more. But this, this is what it's about, and that is what we are up here for today, and why I'm assuming you guys are in the room today. So, thank you.
So, Todd, maybe throwing it to you while I get the questions. Both you and Katie talked about nature-based solutions. Can you give us some examples of what that means here in St. Johns County?
Well, currently there's all kinds of projects going on. I mean, you saw some some photographs of dune replanting, dune renourishment. These things are not just adding plants to the dunes; they're actually creating dune growth by establishing vegetation that captures blowing sand. Part of that requires that there's some sand to blow around, and that's another thing. We look at the amount of development directly on our beaches, and so those dunes protect us in a way that we can't naturally armor the shoreline. So that's one. One that I'm involved in is building oyster reefs. We build a lot of these things throughout the Matanzas River. We do that in a lot of different ways. Unfortunately, there's a lot of just rubble dumping in the waterways that create artificial substrate for oysters to actually grow on. But one of my colleagues, Jose Nunez, is sitting up in the audience there. He developed a really awesome approach to this with a degradable or a biodegradable concrete that actually initiates oyster reefs. We have 10,000 of them outside of the Whitney Lab right now. And if you go down there and look, those oyster reefs are fantastic. They serve a lot of purposes. So those are nature-based solutions. There's others when it comes to vegetation use and natural plants or native plants that do things like help us maintain groundwater and other things like that. So there's a lot of examples out there if you look around in our own community.
So that segues into one of the questions from the audience. The city of St. Augustine is on the cusp of building a taller seawall along the Matanzas River and across the street from my home in Lincolnville. This is a man-made structure, not a nature-based solution. to hold back the tides? Does any part of this plan include nature-based solutions, or is it too late to adapt this type of resilience in that particular situation? I don't know, Katie, if you're familiar with that?
I am not familiar with that particular plan, but generally, I mean, you're spot on for traditional hard armoring is what the state has relied on. And I don't want to sit up here and say nature-based solutions are going to be the answer in every spot in the state, or even what you would be able to get passed in the state, or what a community would choose. But what we do need to move toward is that they are an option and that they are considered. And so part of that is, you know, and I'm not speaking specifically to your project, but DEP is considering right now a living shorelines permit that's in its final stages of being approved that would put that forward for private property owners. There are ways that hard armoring can be combined, hybrid, with more nature-based solutions, and I think that is the answer to move towards. And so pushing your local governments to think about that, to consider those. You know, there's a lot of great studies and reports out there and plans for that through, you know, our different labs and bodies in the state. And there's also a bill in the legislature right now, nature-based solutions. And what this would do is it would clarify regulatory pathways for some of those very green, pure nature-based solutions that we've talked about, as well as these hybrid options, because in some places that is going to be what moves forward. And so having more clarity in that, being able to direct your local government to that, part of the problem we hear is there's no pathway for this. Sure, yeah, I want to do it. There's no pathway in a way that allows me to sustain funding for a project like this at the scale that we would have to do it to protect this critical infrastructure. So I don't know that that is at a point where it could be you know, integrated into this project right now. But what we know about hard armoring is eventually it does fail. And that is an opportunity then to incorporate more hybrid approaches or green approaches in that. And I'll also pass it if there's...
Yeah, I'm happy to add on to that. So the thing about engineering a landscape and ecosystem, or a shoreline in particularly, is generally once you start to engineer it, you have to keep engineering it. These things require ongoing maintenance, and oftentimes they can exacerbate some of the issues that they were intended to fix. And so, like, for example, the seawall project, Lake Maria Sanchez wasn't always a lake. A large portion of that was filled. And so we disturbed the ecosystem services and the wetlands that used to exist there. We placed houses in a vulnerable area, and now we are trying to protect them. And we see this particularly in coastal armoring. When people build seawalls on the beach, is you build the seawall, you protect that structure, but barrier islands move. That's what they do geologically. Over time, barrier islands will retreat. They will often merge with the mainland, and then a sandbar will form offshore and create another barrier island on a geologic timescale, but that's what they do. And so when you install a seawall and you literally draw that line in the sand, now the wave energy from the ocean is hitting that seawall, and instead of having a nice gradual slope for that wave to wash up the shoreline and wash back out to sea, it's of a barrier island. It's also an issue on the intercoastal side of the barrier island. Todd showed that picture of Miami. They don't have any marshes. They don't have any riparian habitat. And that's where, that's the nursery of our food web. That's where all of the little critters get their start and get their food. And so once you start to lose that intertidal habitat, your ecosystem starts to unravel pretty rapidly.
Maybe the last question on sort of this topic, beach renourishment, pro or con? And that's not exactly the question, but the question is, what's your position on beach renourishment? Is that a solution? Is that a problem?
Who wants to stay another 3 hours? What beach renourishment? It is necessary in places because we feel that it is necessary to preserve our beaches. But as Jen was just saying, once you start engineering a coastline, and nourishment is engineering a coastline because we've removed the ability for that coast to replenish naturally because of development and other things that have lined up, then you're doing that forever. And it can be wiped out with a king tide, with a storm, with a hurricane, 1 year after you do it, 3 years after you do it, 5 years after you do it. So, you know, we recognize the need, and so I'm speaking from Surfrider, we recognize the need for it in places, but we have got to move into a more dynamic and comprehensive approach to protecting and preserving our beaches and our coastlines. And so nourishment is incredibly expensive. It is getting harder to find the compatible sand. There are significant consequences that come from the dredge to get that sand up, and the habitat that can be displaced from that, and then the placement of that sand. And it is a really, as I said, expensive. The state has a shortfall. The state cannot fund the amount of nourishment that is needed on our critically eroded beaches. Federal funding is harder to come by. That process is getting difficult. And so there is need, and there are places that need to be prioritized, but we have got to expand into a more comprehensive view of what it means to protect our beaches and our coastal areas.
All right, so Jen, I'm going to change the topic. Yep, sorry. You're going to get the rapid quick fire because we did get quite a few questions about water quality. So quick answers, because I've got 4 different questions to ask on this.
I'm gonna try.
How clean is the Matanzas River?
So, this is not gonna be a quick answer. What do you want, a letter? So it's better than a lot of places in the state, as far as we know. The Matanzas is still one of the last places in the state that you can harvest and eat oysters from seasonally. That's something that we hold in really high regard, but we're seeing nutrient levels creeping up. We're seeing fecal bacteria impairments creeping up, but also the state has a lot of parts of our watershed that they just haven't tested in. So we have a lot of data gaps where we are genuinely not sure what the water quality is like. And our team, Captain Silas is here somewhere, has been trying to fill those gaps and going out and collecting water quality samples to try and make up for it. But one thing that we are seeing that's incredibly concerning is we are starting to see copper impairments in our waterways. And so that's scary because copper is acutely toxic to marine organisms. And where this copper is coming from is that copper sulfate is a common algicide used in stormwater ponds. So if you have a heavily manicured landscape that drains into a stormwater pond, and a lot of that fertilizer enters that stormwater pond, eventually it's gonna cause an algae bloom. That's what happens. And people don't like algae blooms because they're ugly and they smell bad, and so they want them to go away. They dump a bunch of copper sulfate in there. That doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't remove the nutrients. It just kills the algae bloom, but now you have copper sulfate in a pond, and that stuff sticks around. And so when that pond eventually discharges into a waterway, that copper is then entering the waterway. And we're really, really worried about that because, like I said, it's very toxic to marine organisms. And so at that point, you need to address the nutrient issues because otherwise you're just treating the symptom and not the cause.
And the next question is, are drinking water safe to drink in St. Johns County?
I will never tell you whether or not drinking water is safe to drink. I will tell you to defer to your county health departments on that.
Okay. And what about specifically, is there a way for someone to check the safety of their drinking water if they have a well?
Yeah, you have this one?
Yeah, sure. So there's several laboratories in the state of Florida, mine being one of them, that test well water on a regular basis. And we do quite a few different analyses, depending on what you're looking for, but mostly lead, nitrate, fecal coliforms, total coliforms, and a couple other like chloride, things like that. But yes, you can get your water tested, and if you're concerned about it, I highly recommend that you do.
Jen, you referenced the How's My Waterway tool. This person asked, is it still available? Is it likely to remain available? And is it scientifically reliable?
You know, it was the last time I checked, but I haven't looked in like a month, so hopefully it is still up there. And that it is scientifically reliable in that it is based on DEP's data that they're collecting. But as I mentioned, there are some gaps in that data set, so there will be some waterways on there where it will specifically say that there might not be any information available.
Okay. And the last question in this little group, is there somewhere that someone could contact to volunteer to assist in recording water quality, to fill in some of those gaps?
Yeah. So our website, www.matanzasriverkeeper.org. Happy to get folks out on the water.
Okay. All right. I don't know who this group of questions best goes, but really there were a lot of questions about funding of our land conservation. You know, what is the most effective way to protect the remaining undeveloped property? how do we get this issue to get support of everyone so we're not so divisive perhaps on this issue? Someone had the great idea of, could insurance companies help cut off development in Florida, reduce the risk in their portfolios? Why has funding shrunk? There are some funds, but very small amounts. Just generally, where do we get the funds needed to purchase the land to preserve? What can we do on that front?
I'll kick it off. So the best approach to land conservation, I think, is looking at some combination of state and local funding. So as I mentioned, the Florida Forever is the state's land conservation funding program. But unfortunately, it used to be funded at about $300 million annually, and it was like that for a very, very long time. And then under the previous governor's administration, they started to ratchet that back until at one point it was completely unfunded. And so we're starting to creep back up in the right direction, but very incrementally, and we're still nowhere near $300 million. And at the same time, we have all of this land that, as we showed earlier, if it's not getting conserved, it is going to inevitably be developed. And so advocating for more funding, like the legislature is in session right now. So you can punch in your address, look up your legislator and call them and let them know that land conservation is something that's important to you and you think that it needs to be funded. At the local level, we've actually had a little bit of progress there. So back in December, St. Johns County actually adopted what's called the conservation impact fee. And so basically, anytime land is developed, a developer has to pay impact fees to offset the burden that they are putting on a community. So there are impact fees for roads, for schools, for public services, fire stations, things like that. And so the county just adopted a conservation impact fee. So now when land is developed, developers will have to pay into a fund to conserve land to offset some of the development that's happening. And that is one source of funding. It's certainly not a silver bullet solution, but now we have a little bit more money in the pot. My recommendation is that St. Johns County needs to adopt a dedicated local source of revenue. And this is something that a lot of counties have done around the state. You can either do it via property tax, sales tax, or a bond referendum. And when counties and cities in Florida put these on the ballot, the voters overwhelmingly approve them. They generally pass with like a 75% passage rate, and you can't get 75% of Floridians to agree on anything. And so we're really hoping that St. Johns County steps up and decides to put a bond referendum on the ballot this year. And that's a project that we're working on right now. And I will probably call on all of you at some point to start calling our commissioners and asking them to do that because like I said, we've got properties that should be conserved that aren't because the money's just not there. So we really need to have that funding in place so that when those properties become available, we can purchase them.
And Jen, this person asked if you could go back to your slide that you were referring to that the county did not protect and might be developed. Is it Moses Conservation Area? And I guess why does that keep happening?
One more.
Okay, yeah, there we go. So I don't have a pointer, so I can't point, but Moses Creek Conservation Area is the area towards the bottom of the slide where you see that little creek. And a large portion of that is owned and managed by the Water Management District.
Here? I'm sorry,
That's Moses Creek Conservation Area.
Okay.
If you go up to that area that's clear cut up there that hasn't been developed yet on this slide, everything that is waterward of that is about 200 acres, and that's what they had prioritized for conservation, and that's what's currently in the pre-development application process. Yeah, that's how I feel too.
All right, changing topics. Todd, why is sea level rise different in different areas?
Well, we all think that think of sea level as being equal around the planet, but it's actually not. And it's very, very rarely is it actually static. I'm not a trained oceanographer, I'm a chemist, right? But I will tell you that my experience with this is that different areas, and we live in a location called the Southeast Atlantic Bight. If you look at a map of the United States, look at Florida, we kind of stick out as we go south. We bend in right around Jacksonville, and then Georgia starts to bend right back out. That's a focal point for ocean currents and ocean tides. And so we feel that sea level rise a little differently here. There's probably some more advanced explanations of this from the physics side of things, but that area is a focal point for sea level rise and for storm surge and things associated with storms that are in our local area. And it's because of the landforms and the depth of water there. So there's a couple of factors, and I don't know exactly,
Okay.
but I can tell you that it varies significantly around the planet, and it varies significantly on the East Coast.
All right, changing topics completely, we had a couple of questions about AI centers. And one of the question writers says that they take large amounts of water and energy. Are you seeing anything being done around the state to minimize the impact of AI centers on our water? Or I'm going to focus on water since that's more of our topic for this evening.
Sure, and more broadly, so there is a bill before the legislature right now that is specific to data centers, and that's actually quite similar across the country because of these impacts that we're seeing from them, because local governments are concerned, but it's also, there are arguments that have been made for jobs and economic value of these centers and the use of them across the country. So there is a bill right now that would add more oversight requirements for data centers being considered and permitted. That is currently going on in the Florida legislature, and so I would encourage you to take a look at that if it's an area of interest and engage on that topic with the bill sponsors and with the committees that it might be going through. That is a place for that to do. But yes, this is kind of the next big pressing area. And just one thing I will say of what we need to learn from is we need to learn from our past experience and how we have permitted facilities and other things that serve communities, and the frequency that we put those in certain places that burden environmental justice communities, burden communities that have already borne the burden of providing for society and other things. And so siting is really important, and we see impacts. We're seeing a lot of water use from these centers that do exist, and it's on the mind of our legislators, it's on the mind of on the national level as well, if anyone wants to add more specifics.
All right, I've got just some one-off questions, so I'm just going to take these in sort of a random order. And this one, I have to confess, I have no idea what the question is about. Can we outlaw atrazine? A-T-R-A-Z-I-N-E. Anyone want that one?
Probably not. It's
Okay.
unfortunate. Well, so the federal EPA tests these compounds that we use all the time in different mostly in agrochemicals, yard chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, etc. They are tested with a very discrete toxicity test. Most of the aquatics are tested on a fathead minnow, which is really endemic to the middle of the country, right? Unfortunately, the law exists that way. They do their toxicity testing. If the lethal dose is acceptable or very low, they differentiate the legality of using those. We have in the past overcome that. DDT is one that you guys probably remember. 2,4-D has been taken out of some equations. Right now, atrazine is used pretty regularly, and it's a difficult one because there's this thing called lobbying that goes on. And I mean, I'm so excited to be up here with two folks that are actually engaged in the way laws come around and how the state views things. But it takes us to speak out against it to make it work. I mean, all of the chemicals that FWC uses to spray waterway vegetation right now are completely legal according to federal guidelines. Are they the best? Crickets, right? No, they're not. And so the point is that it's kind of on our shoulders, unfortunately, as a community to speak out against it and make it so. Brevard County banned the use of phosphorus fertilizers in their county during the rainy seasons of Florida. Single county. They got pushback from Lowe's and Home Depot, but they had to accept it. You cannot buy phosphorus fertilizer from April to October in Brevard County. So it's doable. If you want atrazine off the shelf, demand it.
So following up maybe on some of those types of where there've been some success at pushing back on things that don't do good to our environment, a couple people asked about plastic production increasing, someone asked about why we're not mandating using paper compostable bags for lawn debris, for example. That people put their lawn debris in plastic bags that don't, I guess, get mulched. They get mulched under the composting site, but I assume just stay there. Anyone have thoughts? These weren't really things we addressed, but
So broadly on the state level, on the plastics topic, in 2008, Florida was the first state in the country to pass the ban on banning bags. So saying that preemption Jen was talking about, we were the first state that came out and said, local governments, local communities, we see you thinking about it, we see you trying it. No, you can't do this. You cannot put forward any regulations that regulate the use, sale, or distribution of auxiliary containers and plastic bags. And so that's what set up kind of this really difficult landscape we are currently in, and we've seen additional laws come forward. So polystyrene then was another law that was put on the books. Polystyrene is expanded foam. And so then we saw another law come forward that preempted polystyrene regulations because they realized, oh, that wasn't included in the last one we preempted. And they preempted that with a few exceptions for public property and grandfathering in existing ordinances. Specifically, Miami Beach passed a polystyrene ordinance that banned the sale of polystyrene, so the sale of foam coolers. That's a big one that applied to private business. It got grandfathered in that 2018 time. But what we've seen in the ensuing years from 2018 is we've seen really growing efforts to expand that preemption, to really try to limit everything for local governments so that they can't be working in these areas that they currently can on public property in things that fall outside of what auxiliary containers or plastic bags are. And so that is what many groups have fought against, because that massive expansion would paralyze our local governments, set us back in so many ways that we see impacting public health, stormwater systems, marine debris, and environments. And there is actually a very good, practical, measured bill moving forward in the legislature right now titled Auxiliary Containers. And this does try to present a pathway forward for our local communities while also providing uniformity for businesses, the opportunity to have input, and a statewide marine debris reduction plan. And so I would encourage you to support that bill, SB 240, HB 575, and look into groups that have information about this, action alerts, Florida Springs Council, Surfrider, Matanzas Riverkeeper, and others who are really working on this bill.
Thank you. Katie, someone in the audience would like to talk with you because they'd like to get more involved with Surfrider. But the question was that beach cleanups are okay, but would it be better for volunteers to do projects such as replanting in dunes, mangroves? Is that something that your organization does, or Jen, is that something your organization does?
Yes to both. And so just kind of one quick thing on cleanups. So cleanups are about awareness. They're about a problem that's right in front of us. We know we cannot clean these beaches to, to where we would like them to get, but we're out there because that's awareness. That's improving something that we are enjoying. It's a place that we love. We should be contributing and giving back to it. And we collect that data, and so do other organizations. And we use that data when I go into offices and can look at the district that they are, and I can find the exact pounds that have been picked up in the last month on that beach, the number of cigarette butts, and then use that at the local level to say, hey, let's not have smoking on the beaches because these butts persist. They are plastic. They stay. And so that's the kind of the idea behind the cleanups. It's being out, it's being visible, and it's getting that data that we use as evidence. To the next part of your question, yes, there are more opportunities and things engaged on. We run a climate action program that really engages in some of those nature-based solutions I talked about, invasives removal, working on partnerships with local governments and others for planting of native plants, ocean-friendly gardens, all of these things that are other ways getting to that stewardship and science piece of our work. And that is the same for many groups. I mean, Matanzas Riverkeeper does incredible work as well in that.
All right. The last question someone asked is, where are the young people tonight? I will say that I have 3 20-something children, and this is their number one issue, is the environment, that our young people are very well educated on this, and they need us to be equally as educated on that. Todd, you interact with students. what's your take on where young people on these topics?
All my students are in the lab right now working.
No, the truth of it is they are. And I'm gonna do a little thing here because I asked you about how you learned about tonight, and this is a good example. That generation has these in their hand all the time. This is absolutely your most powerful tool since the Clean Water Act to protect the environment. And if you're not using it, I want to encourage you to. Now, that doesn't mean scroll all day and forget to do what you're supposed to do. But what that means is you can reach out. You can reach out to your legislators. You can reach out to others. You can reach out to your friends. Let them know about things. Encourage them to move forward. Tell your county commissioners what you want. A lot of us don't sit down and type out letters anymore and send them to in the mail. Email is super easy and it's a quick way to flood. But politicians pay attention. I'll tell you a little story.
Go for it.
I got funding from Randy Fine to do clam restoration in the IRL because of a Facebook page. But it wasn't my Facebook page, it was his. He asked the public, what do you guys want to see? Do you want to see more dredging? You want to see more septic to sewer conversion? And people liked the clam project and they blew him up. And he gave us funding to do that. I want to encourage you to use this. If you're not using it right now, to use it. Social media is a black hole, so be careful. But I will say that it is one of the most powerful tools we have to actually have our voice heard. And the politicians pay attention. So,
Call
be
to
responsible
action.
with it, though.
Call
there's
to action? Do you want to?
Well, that is my call
Do you
to
want to
action.
go, you have a slide at the very end if you want to.
Oh, okay. Well, what I just said,
Yeah.
with the caveat that that's you do it responsibly. We have a tendency, unfortunately, and all of us do, I won't leave anybody out, that we'll bring up an issue, or we'll see an issue, and we'll comment on that, and we'll throw in some kind of political jab. I want to caution us not to dilute our message, okay? We're not attacking every single thing that goes on that's wrong. Social media is a great tool. Use it discreetly to address a particular thing. That bill to allow hotels and paddleball courts and things like that in our state parks, we found out about it like this. My students came to me with it one day and said, have you heard about this thing? And they were on the front line. The younger folks are very much plugged in. And there's a lot of information and the wealth of information available out there, but you have the power to hit that button, a view, or share it. And those things catch momentum. And I don't think without social media, we would have been aware of that situation. I think that may have slipped right by us. And so I want to encourage you to do it. I want you to encourage you to do it responsibly, though, and not be divisive. It bothers me greatly that environmental issues have to be one political side or the other. I work with Coastal Conservation Association, Ducks Unlimited. These are extremely conservative member-based, but they fund a tremendous amount of conservation in the state of Florida. And so we don't want to dissuade our collaborators on conservation issues with other things. That's a different conversation. But if we can keep conservation in the limelight and we're united on it, you see the evidence with the bipartisan votes for some of these things. The public made it happen, and that's your voice. It's right there on your phone, so please use it.
All right, with that, I would like to thank Todd, Jen, Katie, and Tim for their work putting together presentations. And I know you can get some information about Matanzas River Keepers and Surfrider out in the lobby on your way out. So thank you for spending your Wednesday evening with us.